on.
Well, make sure it's on there. No voices exist. Try it. Blow on it.
Yeah, electrician. Here.
No.
Well, welcome. Going to be my little introduction speech. Usually I can mask this through a microphone, but today I'm not going to. I'm Marty Miller from the Department of Sociology. We have a very distinguished speaker today. And is someone coming to help us? Can't find anybody? Okay. Well, I've had a delightful couple of hours with our speaker, and find him to be a very good scholar, historian, humorist. We really enjoyed, and we're really in for a very pleasurable experience. You have a whole bunch of things that you've done, so let me tell the audience something about you so they know who's speaking. Sir Robert Mark joined the Manchester City Police in 1937. I wasn't even born yet in 1937. And served successively in the Uniform Branch Criminal Investigation Department, Administration Department until 1956, when, as superintendent, he was appointed Chief Constable of Leicester. His service with the Manchester Force included a period of military service with the Royal Army Corps as a lieutenant in the Phantom. After 10 years as Chief Constable of Leicester, he was appointed in 1967 to the Metropolitan Force as an Assistant Commissioner and later Assistant Commissioner of Traffic. On April 5th, 1968, he was appointed Deputy Commissioner and became Commissioner of Police of the Metropolis on April 17, 1972. During 1966, Sir Robert was a member of the Standing Advisory Council on the Penal System and was an assessor, I'll get it yet, to Lord Mountbatten? Mountbatten. My goodness. Such hard words, English subject. Inquiry into the prison security in that year. In 1969, he was a member of the Advisory Committee on Police in Northern Ireland, the Hunt Committee. He was elected an honorary LLM at Leicester University in 1967, a visiting fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford in 1970, and an MA in Oxford University in 1972, honorary degree of Doctors of Letters at Loughborough University in 1976. Sir Robert was awarded the Queen's Police Medal for Distinguished Service in 1965. The honor of Knight Bachelor was conferred upon him by Her Majesty the Queen in the New Year Honors List 1973. Appointed Knight Grand Cross of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire in the New Year Honors List 1977. Whole bunch of things here. So, what I will now do is introduce our guest speaker tonight.
It's supposed to be ours.
Nothing.
Never mind, let's go on.
Okay. Well, in the meantime, Sir Robert Mark.
Thank you. Had that gentleman been able to make this thing work, I would have produced a quotation with which I'm perfectly certain that you would all have been familiar. For this relief, much thanks. Marcellus to Bernardo, Act 1, Scene 1. I'm sure I don't have to fill in the play for you. I must ask your indulgence in advance. I've been in your country now for 17 days, and Henry Kissinger has nothing on me. I'm not even quite sure which state I'm in. I had 3 breakfasts this morning, and the time went back quite a lot during the day, but I've enjoyed my time here so much that I've ceased to care. But I must tell those of you who've come here to listen to stories about cops and robbers. In fact, I could almost quote Cromwell's remark to the Long Parliament that you have sat here too long for any good that you may be doing, because I'm not going to talk about cops and robbers, if only because you've got rather more than we have. I'm going to talk about things that I think really matter in both our countries, and that's a very different thing indeed. Very roughly, for those of you who want to try to follow the thread of what is rather a long and rambling discourse, it's going to fall under the headings of organisation, political freedom, security of tenure, lack of firearms, terrorism, public respect, and the system of justice. Those are going to be the 6 prime topics of my conversation. Let me therefore say, without really implying a scintilla of impoliteness, that if any one of you is not interested in that particular kind of subject and you feel like stealing away, or your best girlfriend has put a deadline on the amount of time you're allowed to stay, I shall not be in the slightest degree offended. I have slept through many lectures in my time, and I feel much fellow feeling for those who suffer urges of that kind as and when the need arises. Now, you may think that the strongest bond uniting human beings is love, either spiritual or fleshly, because that's what we're very often told by those who would like us to believe that, but you can take it from me, that's entirely mistaken. The strongest bond between human beings is that forged by common suffering, by shared suffering. The American prisoners on Corregidor and Bataan, and the British in Changi Jail on Singapore Island, or on the infamous Burma Railway, or those who about 45 years ago now attended my school's production of Mozart's Magic Flute. They could tell you about the validity of that particular theory, and I may say in an indiscreet moment that I actually sang the part of Pamina in that particular production, to the great discomfiture of the audience. Now, the remainder of you who haven't had such salutary experience in your young lives, I propose to remedy that omission for you in the next 50 minutes or so. Now, I'd better begin by disillusioning the innocent amongst you, because I'm sure there must be some innocent amongst you. I suppose it's true that for about 100 years now, the 4 words which have required no explanation at all in the English language have been Sherlock Holmes and Scotland Yard. Now, Sherlock Holmes, I'm sorry to tell you, really was fictional. But there are still people to this day who believe that he really lived at 221B Baker Street with his friend Dr. Watson and his pipe and his shag and so on. And I may tell you that in my 5 years as Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, I'm happy to tell you that I received quite a deal of correspondence for him, which I dutifully forwarded to that address. And as none of it came back, I suppose there just is a suspicion that he may be around. But as a professional policeman, I don't resent him at all. In fact, I rather approve of him, because if you think about it, in both our countries, Sherlock Holmes, or rather his creator, Conan Doyle, they were the very first people to make the investigation of crime socially respectable. Just think about it. Before then, it was really rather a sordid occupation. As Robert Peel said, not fit for the sons of gentlemen. It was left to watchmen and parish constables, usually thoroughly disreputable characters in England who worked for blood money, that is, money paid to informers. And they were so unsuccessful, and the system of justice was so appalling, that it frequently took the form of brutal, speedy, and very often questionable retribution. Now, Sherlock Holmes, although he tended to ridicule the policemen of the Victorian age, and I'm bound to tell you with a great deal of justification, he did at least persuade the public in a curious sort of way, for the very first time, that the detection of crime could involve the use of brains, of logic, of perseverance, and even dedication to the public interest, rather than simply to private gain. And of course, the detective story gradually filled the gap left by the ancient morality play which once flourished in Europe before the days of television, long before the days of television, in which good always triumphed over evil because there was a natural public desire for that result. Today, the detective story virtually monopolizes your television and cinema screens, and indeed much of the world of literature, or what laughingly passes for literature. And I suppose this is understandable because if you're honest, and I'm sure this applies to most of you, we all find sin much more entertaining than virtue, and we all find crime very much more newsworthy than honesty. Of course, occasionally authors and producers do throw out a sop to public opinion. They occasionally allow unpleasant reality to ruffle the complacency which a morality play is designed to encourage. But the public conception of crime in your country, as well as mine, is largely fictional and misleading. Very, very few people have any real knowledge about it. And I'm sorry to say this will always be the case for a very simple reason, that the laws of contempt, libel, and privilege in both our countries make frank discussion of the reality of crime, criminals, and justice virtually impossible, perhaps more so in my country than in yours. This is a point I'd like to come back to. But for the moment, I want to bring you back to reality and repeat quite quickly that Scotland Yard is real. In fact, since 1829, it has been nothing more than the name of the headquarters of the London Metropolitan Force. When Robert Peel, a very distinguished Victorian statesman, established the Metropolitan Force, which was the first English professional police force, he found it a home in a small area of the Palace of Whitehall, which was then known and had been known for many, many years as Scotland, because legend has it that since 960 AD, it had been given to the King of Scotland on which to build a house for himself or his ambassador when he came to London once a year to pay homage for land owned by the Scottish Crown south of the Tweed. So the Metropolitan Police address simply ran Metropolitan Police Office, Scotland Yard, London. And that's the origin of the name. Of course, we soon outgrew it. We had about 26,500 men now, many more than we had when the force first began. And in the 1890, we moved to the famous building, I'm sure you've all seen pictures of it, with the round turrets and the wrought iron gates on the embankment of the Thames. Typically English, it wasn't designed as a police station at all. It was intended to be the first national opera house. And if you manage to find your way into the cellars, you'll be deeply disappointed to see that there are no gyves or racks or thumb screws or any of the other impedimenta that you might associate with a police station. All you'll see is that the cellars were designed as changing rooms for the artists who in fact never occupied them. I've no doubt they were put to even better use. Again in 67, we outgrew that place, and we moved to a giant building down the road in Victoria Street, just down the road from the House of Commons, and I may tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that that is not a proximity which we particularly enjoy. But we took our name with us. But just to make things proper, we added the word new. And if you see it now, you'll see a revolving sign which says New Scotland Yard. Don't make any mistakes about it. It isn't known as that in the trade. It's just called the yard. If somebody flips a pasteboard card at you and says he's from the yard, don't think he means the place behind any house. There's only one yard in Great Britain, and he usually means business when he says that. Now, again, you see, the mythical idea of Scotland Yard is that we police the whole country. That's created by the crime novel and the cinema screen, because no detective is ever good enough for the crime writer. He must be from Scotland Yard. Wouldn't do to say that he's from anywhere else. And the truth is that we perform a few specialist services like your FBI. We maintain a fingerprint bureau and a criminal record office for the whole nation. But we're really only directly responsible for policing an area of about 800 square miles. And you can describe it by saying that it's covered by a circle with a diameter of about 18 or 19 miles based on Charing Cross in the centre of London. But, you know, typically English again. The Metropolitan Police District, as we call it, or the MPD, it doesn't cover the 1 square mile of the ancient city of London right in the centre of that 800 square mile. Oh no, that wouldn't do. That has its own police force of 1,000 men. Has its Lord Mayor, its Mansion House, the Bank of England, St. Paul's Cathedral, the Guildhall, and the ancient figure of justice on the top of the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey. 1,000 men, the only police force in the world with only 5 crimes per policeman per annum, because there are, of course, only about 3,000 or 4,000 people who live in the square mile of London. But they wear enormous Grecian or Trojan helmets, and not one of them is less than 5 feet 11 inches tall. And when they're feeling fairly amiable, they refer to us, without any Irish connotations, as the little people. And when they're feeling rather less amiable, they refer to us rather unkindly as the metronomes. But in fact, relations between the two couldn't be better. And I only mention this because this is common, and it's the first real point I want to make to you. This is typical of the British police system, the organisational aspect. You see, unlike the United States, there is absolutely no proliferation of law enforcement agencies in Britain. And there are no problems at all of conflicting or overlapping jurisdictions. The 50 million people of England and Wales are served by 125,000 policemen and women. And they are grouped for administrative and financial purposes into only 43 police forces. And these vary in size from the 26,500 metropolitan, with an additional 12,000 civilians, to the smallest provincial force, which is Cambridgeshire, of between 700 and 800 police officers. Now, this is rather different from you. You have a population of 220 million, and if you discount the forces of under 10 men in the United States, you're served by about 17,500 police forces, and, of course, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. There's another very significant difference too. The personal authority conferred on each policeman in Britain by the law when he swears his oath of allegiance to the Crown under the Police Act extends throughout the whole country. But each of the 43 forces exercises exclusive authority within its own area for the enforcement of the criminal law. In other words, if I stray from London to Wales or somewhere else, and as a police officer I find it necessary to intervene as a law enforcement officer, I have the power in law to do so, but I come under the command of the chief police officer of the district in which I happen to be. So there is no conflict of sovereignty. Now, the cost is quite important because it allows us to achieve uniformity in a typically devious English manner. The cost of all the police force, all the 43 of them, is paid for initially by local taxation, by you, the local taxpayers. But you get half of it back again from the central government it's a big but, because to earn that half, you must comply with regulations made by the Home Secretary, who is a very senior minister, about the fourth senior member of the Cabinet, responsible for police and prisons. And he makes regulations after consultation with representatives of the police themselves at 3 levels, junior, intermediate and senior, and local police authorities, which I'll explain in a moment, and the central government. He makes these regulations in a body called the Police Council for Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And then he promulgates them under the Police Act. And they ensure complete uniformity in every aspect of policing: qualifications for appointment, rules for promotion, procedures for discipline, pay, pensions, allowances. Every single aspect of police administration is governed by those regulations. And if you want to get half your money back, you must comply. And the Home Secretary has an inspectorate to make sure that you do. Now, think about that. This means we can do a lot of things together. Why have 43 training schools to train recruits when you can do it much more efficiently with 6, 7 or 8 and allow all your men to train together and thus ensure common standards of training with probably more efficient staff, both police and academic? Why not train detectives together so that you ensure, again, similar skills in every force? Why not join together to provide police wireless for the whole country? You do it much more efficiently and much more cheaply. The same thing with forensic science. All our forensic science requirements are met by what we call shared or common services. And perhaps most important of all, we provide a national police college in the same way, of very, very high standard. And that trains people who are likely to have a rapid career in the police, as well as people who are likely to achieve very high rank. And it sends people to universities without requiring them to enter any contract at all. If you do well at the police college, not only are you promoted, you're given a place at an English university. We hope you come back to us, but even if you don't, we think that you're still a better citizen. Now, interchange between the 43 forces is encouraged. And if you're going to rise to senior rank, it is obligatory. You cannot rise to command an English police force or a Welsh police force in which you began your service. You must move. And almost certainly you must have undergone training at the police college. So the practical effect is that if you came to Britain and you looked at our police service superficially, you would think you were looking at a national police service. But in fact, you wouldn't be. You'd be looking at 43 autonomous forces working together, enjoying common standards, and operationally entirely independent. Now, although every force other than the Metropolitan is administratively subject to administration control by local government, that is to say that local police authorities have a part to play in administration and finance, the next important point I want you to understand, because this is really rather a difference from your system, is that they are all 43 are entirely free from interference in their operational role. It's very important that you understand this subtle but clear and definite separation of administration and finance on the one hand, in which politics can have some influence, and operations or prosecutions on the other, in which they can have none. Now, from the point of view of a chief officer, clearly this can be very important when you're considering how best to deal with certain forms of crime, political demonstrations, campus riots, industrial disputes, terrorism. We don't have a system of district attorneys at all. Local government, or what I think you would call City Hall, has nothing at all to do with operational matters or decisions whether or not to prosecute in particular cases. Every single police officer in Britain, from the lowest to the highest, is an independent officer of the Crown, and he exercises a natural authority which cannot be widened or restricted by anyone save Parliament alone. There is a very small exception to this. In a tiny number of cases, such as treason, sedition, murder, or generally offences against the state, that personal authority is superseded by statute law, by a director of public prosecutions. But he is a whole-time lawyer enjoying office for life. He doesn't change with governments. And he is accountable to the Attorney General, who as a member of the government is accountable to Parliament and must answer questions in Parliament. One important benefit of this is that the director controls every single case in the entire country in which a police officer is alleged to have done wrong, whether he's committed a crime or a traffic offence. The chief officer is not allowed in that case to decide whether to prosecute or not. That case must always go to the director. So you see, we're protected from the allegation or the suspicion of judging our own cause. Another very important point, particularly from the point of view of your senior officers, is that in Britain we enjoy a very, very high degree of security of tenure. Chief officers can be removed from office by local police authorities with the consent or even by the direction of the Home Secretary, but the safeguards against the improper use of that power are very, very powerful. In fact, it hasn't been used during my 40 years service with the police. And the system of promotion within the force too, that again is totally free from political influence. You can see the point I'm trying to make to you. The effect in Britain is that policemen not only can, but they do invoke the law against anyone at all without fear of the consequence. Only the Queen and members of diplomatic missions are immune. Other members of the royal family and cabinet ministers have been prosecuted to conviction for traffic offences in comparatively recent months. In fact, I must say I sometimes feel that it's perhaps fortunate that one member of our royal family is so proficient a horse rider, since she happens at the moment to be disqualified from driving for 12 months. Now, I tell you this simply to illustrate what I believe to be, without any question, the paramount importance of the basic principle governing the British police system. That in carrying out our duty to enforce the law, we do not act as the servants of government, of local government, of any minister, of any mayor, of any official at all. We act on behalf of the community as a whole, on behalf of the people. And this is our surest safeguard when we are confronted with situations with political implications. And of course, it's more important than any other factor in determining the support of a public which is perfectly properly and naturally divided by politics. Let me illustrate it for you even more clearly. Unlike the army, which represents the ultimate sanction of force available to the government under the orders of a minister, the police represent the people, all the people, including minorities, and they do so in Britain without force, or with only such force as is sure of commanding the support of the courts or of public opinion. There is the essential difference in Britain. Now, I mentioned local police authorities. I'd better tell you quickly what they consist of. I think you call them elected councilmen. We call them elected representatives. 2 to every magistrate. Now, magistrates in Britain are appointed by the Lord Chancellor, who is head of the judiciary. They're unpaid, and they hold office for life. Even the judges at all levels in Britain are non-elective. They're all professional lawyers who cannot be removed from office except by a petition from both Houses of Parliament to the Queen. And that doesn't happen very often. In fact, the last time it happened was to Sir Francis Bacon, whom I think the historians amongst you will recognise was somewhat before our time. You see, the picture I'm trying to paint to you simply in Britain is if you describe the judicial process as beginning when a constable taps you on the shoulder with or without a warrant, or hands you a summons and takes you to court, and then it goes through the process of the lower courts, the higher courts, the appeal courts, right to the judicial committee of the House of Lords, which is our highest appeal court, at no point at all does politics have any part to play or any influence in it. And indeed, there is no quicker way to end a political career than to try to contravene that rule in Britain. Now, having given you a very, very brief outline of the system, why do you think I call this talk a mirror of society? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly what the police are, not merely in Britain, but here and all over the rest of the world. Just think about it. In an authoritarian society, and you don't have to look very far to find those, you will find authoritarian police because it can't exist without them. In an armed society, a society which may be perfectly properly armed because of its history and its social evolution, you must find armed police. In a corrupt society, politically or economically, you will find corrupt police. And in a liberal and an open society, a liberal and open police system. Of course, you can have elements of all four in any one society, especially if your society embraces a vast continent rather than a small island like Great Britain. System should appreciate that the cause is not attributable to the police, but to society itself. Society, you make the laws through your elected representatives. Society determines the size of the police force, its equipment, and the rules under which it operates. Society creates the conditions which make crime more or less likely. It settles penal policy. It makes the rules for deciding guilt. The police are simply one of the instruments by which society attempts to achieve the stability for which all civilized peoples strive. The security of persons and property, the rights of minorities under the law, and so on. And in fact, the police are the most vulnerable, because if you think about it, the more free, the more wealthy, the better educated, the more widely traveled, the better informed that people are, the more likely they are to question convention, custom, and precedent. Dissent these days, ladies and gentlemen, is much less likely from what we in England call the slums than from the universities, and understandably so. So to some extent, of course, the task of the police can, or at least could, be made easier by continual revision of the laws to make their task easier, to make the laws more acceptable and in keeping with current standards and opinion. But you know as well as I do that in most democratic countries, and certainly in yours and mine, the legislature finds this a time-consuming, a controversial, and often a very difficult process. Can I give you better examples than pot and gun control? Now, what we loosely call law and order really consists of four separate related processes. It has nothing to do with the catchword phrase used by the mayor standing for election, who frequently doesn't even understand himself what it means. The first part is the making of laws and their continual revision to keep pace with change. The second is the enforcement of those laws by the police. Just see it as a continuing process. The third is the machinery and the rules for trying offenders run by the lawyers. And the fourth, penology, or what you do with those found guilty. All those processes can and in fact must relate to the other three. Why on earth, therefore, in both our countries, do we always consider them in isolation? For example, what on earth is the use of making a law which can't be enforced? All you do is simply to bring the general system of law into disrepute. Prohibition, surely, is the classic example of this. What useful purpose is served by convicting people if people do not regard with disapproval what they have done? And perhaps most important of all, and this is a very serious point, if your penology in your society includes putting people to death or flogging them, isn't it essential, absolutely essential, to ensure that the procedures of investigation by the police and trial by the courts eliminate, so far as is humanly possible, the awful possibility of the innocent faced with that punishment upon conviction? But since you can't have two systems of investigation and trial in any one society, doesn't this make the task of proving the guilt of the overwhelming majority of the other offenders too difficult? Let me explain what I mean. Our own Law Society in Britain, this is an organisation which represents one half of our legal profession. They used to argue very complacently that since the annual criminal statistics produced by the Lord Chancellor and the Home Office showed an acquittal rate in jury trials of only 8%, there couldn't possibly be any justification for easing the task of the prosecution. But research by the police in 1965, not by the lawyers, not by academics, research at the coalface by the police, showed that 80 out of every 100 people committed for trial pleaded guilty on arraignment. So you see, the 8 acquittals only related to the 20 contested cases, producing an acquittal rate not of 8%, but of 40%. And since the increased availability of legal aid, of which I personally warmly approve, it is now 50%. Now you may think that that gives us cause for worry. I think perhaps I should tell you that in one of your periodicals, the acquittal rates for some American jurisdictions are even higher. In Washington and San Diego County, they are 66%. In Chicago, 74%. In Baltimore, 56%. In Detroit, 42%. And in Los Angeles County, 54%. These are the figures in your country. When I add to that the remarkable fact that the New York City Police arrested 94,071 people for felony in 1971 and were only able to bring 558 to trial, you then begin to see the problem in perspective. You see, the system isn't tested by guilty pleas, and it clearly fails in just that area where it's necessary to the public opinion that it ought to succeed. And I mean deliberate crime, which is very unlikely to produce guilty pleas. Within 2 years of the research I mentioned in Britain by the police, within 2 years, the 600-years-old requirement of unanimous findings of guilt by juries had been varied by Parliament to allow guilty verdicts notwithstanding 2 dissensions in every jury. And since then, roughly 1 in every 9 verdicts of guilt is by majority in Britain. And what is even more interesting is that despite the initial bitter opposition by the bench and the bar and the press, today the change is accepted by all three as being without any semblance of injustice or disadvantage. But we couldn't possibly have achieved that change if we had, and undoubtedly this is the most beneficial change in criminal justice in Britain in this whole century, we couldn't possibly have achieved it if we had had the death penalty and flogging. It was a price very well worth paying in Britain. I'm not able to comment on any other country, but in Britain last year there were 565 homicides, and that includes all murders, manslaughters, infanticides, and deaths from terrorism. This is less than 2/3 of the number in the single city of Detroit. And most of our homicides are not the kind of murders for which anyone would wish in any case to apply the death sentence. Many of them are killings between people who know each other, who kill on the spur of the moment. There are usually less than 10 murders each year in Britain for which even those who favour the death penalty would wish to see it applied. So whatever the deterrent value, and I'm not disputing the fact that the death penalty may have a deterrent value in some cases, whatever its deterrent value or whatever dubious satisfaction you may feel from hanging a singularly atrocious murderer, surely it's too high a price to pay if it prevents the reform of the whole judicial process, which is weighted too heavily in favour of the suspected or accused person, and allows some thousands of unjustified acquittals each year. Common sense, ladies and gentlemen, not genius, simple common sense suggests that the best deterrent to deliberate crime is not the severity of punishment unlikely to be applied in the majority of cases because of excessive safeguards for the accused. Surely it's rather in the likelihood of being caught, followed by a high probability of conviction of the guilty. If you can achieve such a probability, that will encourage a less punitive and vengeful reaction by the courts, which I think arises subconsciously from the too frequent failure of the lengthy and costly judicial process. That's why after 25 years police service, having no moral, religious or other reservations about the taking of human life in certain very limited and extreme circumstances, I turned against the death penalty as the greatest single obstacle to increasing the effectiveness of the criminal law. I believe that the purpose of the criminal law should be to establish the truth with which it is not at all concerned in either of our two countries, rather than technical guilt as a prerequisite to punishment, and that it should put deterrence to crime, the protection of society, the rehabilitation of the offender, and the compensation of the victim before that degree of retribution which society thinks proper to mark antisocial conduct. And I don't imply for one moment that retribution does not have a perfectly proper part in criminal justice. I'm merely asking you to see an order of priorities. Now, I mentioned the 4 parts of law and order to show that we, the police, here and in Britain, we're not by any means solely responsible for our own public image. The legislator, and by that I mean the politician, the lawyer, the judge, the penologist, they all play a part in creating it, as of course do the press and public opinion. Against that background, let me try briefly to explain the present position of the police in Britain, because there they probably rank higher in public confidence and respect than anywhere else in the world, despite a continual increase in crime and occasional well-publicized misbehavior or wrongdoing by individual policemen. And I'll begin by making what you may well think is a seemingly outrageous statement, that conventional crime, and by that I mean crime from murder to theft, is not really such a serious social problem in Britain as is sometimes claimed. It increases, of course, each year, but some of the reasons for that increase are both natural and quite surprising. One of them is the raising of the school leaving age from 15 to 16, with a vast increase in truancy, burglary, theft, and auto crime. Another is the spread of private insurance, which means that more people report crime to the police as a prerequisite to an insurance claim. And we never really know whether we've got an increase in crime or an increase in reports of crime, which is really rather a different thing. Of the 2,100,000 crimes we had last year, only about 5% could be classified as crimes of violence. I mentioned the 565 homicides. We only had 1,094 rapes. I did hear somebody say rather complainingly that we weren't awfully good at it. We had 11,600 robberies, apparently, at which we were rather better. But 1,800,000, the vast total of crime generally, is burglary, theft, and auto crime. And we believe that a great amount of that, probably 60 or 70%, is committed by juveniles. Even that has a happier aspect in that most of them, although they're an infernal nuisance, most of them do not grow up into persistent criminals. Now, the proportion of violent crime that we, as we say, clear up in England, that means that we arrest somebody, is fairly high. Of the 565 homicides, we cleared up 548. And of the 1,094 rapes, we managed to clear up 797. For obvious reasons, partly because we concentrate our limited resources on those crimes which really do outrage the public. There's a second reason which we are not always quite so willing to publicize, and that is that research shows that half the wrongdoers in all cases of violence against the person in Britain are known at the outset. They are therefore known to the police as self-detecting crimes, but this isn't a description we like to give them in case it impairs our public image as efficient detectives. Of course, you still get a lot of argument about crime in Britain, as you do here. Politicians, academics, lawyers, and social workers. And of course, it does disturb public opinion from time to time when you have a particularly revolting or horrifying crime. But on the whole, the situation from our point of view is as I have described it, but it does have its disadvantages, which I mustn't conceal from you. It's encouraged a very disturbing trend. Successive governments, both Conservative and Labour, that is both right and left, have felt able to place more importance on compensating or offsetting the result of crime after it has occurred, rather than in trying to fulfill the original police purpose of prevention by increasing the numbers or the powers of the police in Britain. Just consider this. They don't even ensure that the police are thickest on the ground where they're most needed. We have, last year in London, we had 472,000 reported crimes, and we had roughly the same number of policemen, within a dozen or two, of the 21,000 we had in 1921, when recorded crime amounted to 17,500. And provincial forces have increased in the meantime from 37,000 to 85,000, but even they're thinnest on the ground in the great cities where they're most needed. So you see, this combination of what on the surface is a seemingly enlightened policy for softening the effect of crime, for bearing it communally, coupled with an inexcusable failure to deploy police manpower to where it really is needed, to those areas in which crime and social problems are likely, has without any question in Britain created an Achilles heel. Increasing unemployment, 1.6 million, 6% of our labour force. Inflation, political extremism of the right and left, racial problems in which we lack your expertise and experience, and above all, weak government by both parties, have collectively made the maintenance of public order in its widest sense, without any question, the most serious problem for the police in Britain today, far more serious than what might be described as conventional crime. In the Metropolitan Force, we use about 25,000 men a year at least to control public order, industrial disputes, and demonstrations. Now, I don't mean that we're facing anarchy. I don't want you to go away from here tonight and think that Britain is on the point of collapse. Nothing of the kind. I simply want you to see the problems of the evolution of our police service in perspective. It's simply that a new egalitarianism and excessive social security, not by any means without their beneficial aspects, have made it easy not to work in Britain or to dissent, sometimes unlawfully and violently, without any risk of real hardship or effective penal sanction. And this enables those who control the real sources of productivity, the miners, the power workers, the seamen, and so on, to have a hitherto unimagined influence on central government, deeply resented by the silent majority. Silent because they have no collective entity, and they certainly have no spokesman. There are those in Britain today who question whether the seat of government is in Transport House, the home of the trade union movement, or in Whitehall, or to put it in your rather more colourful vernacular, there are those who wonder which is the ventriloquist and which is the dummy. But, as with most things in Britain, the portents are not wholly bad. You see, the bulk of the trade union membership is moderate and pretty decent by tradition, and they ought not to be judged by their more extreme and newsworthy leaders, very few of whom command widespread respect or support. In fact, some of them are seemingly rather frightened by power and influence they never expected, and as a result they've tended to move from extremism to moderation, which again is typically English. And moreover, the tensions which are provoked by this kind of social change are far from being without advantage for the police. You know, people worried by strikes, by inflation, and by unemployment, they desperately want security. And in Britain, they see the police as a bastion on which they know they can always rely. The willingness of the police to contain this kind of situation, these frictions, these social strains, without the use of firearms, without tear gas, water cannon, or any equipment of that kind, often at the cost of considerable injury to the police. We send 3 men off duty in the metropolis every 2 days after being assaulted, without complaint, as part of the price we pay for what we call the doctrine of minimum force. That commands widespread public admiration. And this, added to the extraordinary success of the police against terrorism, has gained us in Britain today a very enviable status. There have been several impartial public opinion polls in the last 2 or 3 years, none of them commissioned by the police. And they all show the same result, that we enjoy today more respect and confidence than any other organization, learned profession, or other institution in Britain except only the monarchy. Now, by way of interesting contrast, Parliament and the trade unions feature way down in the polls. The latter, I'm sorry to tell you, at the bottom. So I'm asking you to believe in what you may conceive to be almost impossible, but which I assure you is nevertheless the truth. That in Britain we have the remarkable situation in a free society in which, despite the propaganda of the liberals and the extreme left, the police, not Parliament, not the courts, not the press, the police are seen by the great majority of the people as the real protectors of their freedom, as indeed, in fact, they are. The known unwillingness of the police to carry firearms as a routine measure is undoubtedly a very weighty factor in achieving that result. But of course, in reality, it's simply common sense. There are only 185,000 firearm certificates in the whole of Britain, less than 4,000 in London. It's true that certificates can relate to more than one weapon, but they're mostly war trophies or pistols or rifles for use under controlled conditions in clubs and so on. The police control the grant of firearm certificates, and they do it very strictly. To give you an idea, bank guards, security guards, private detectives, in fact citizens generally, have absolutely no hope of obtaining a firearm certificate. And possession of a firearm without a firearm certificate is an arrestable offence, a very serious offence, and you may smile, but because of our different traditions is regarded by almost the whole of society as being very antisocial indeed. In fact, it may surprise you to know that the great majority of our criminal classes regard the possession of a firearm with distaste. Penalties are very severe. If you are caught in unlawful possession of a firearm, you face a 5-year sentence. If you commit a robbery with an imitation firearm, you face the possibility of a 14-year sentence. They were used only in a very small number of violent crimes last year. And so there's no need for the police to use firearms as a routine measure unless they're faced with difficult, explosive siege situations such as the Spaghetti House siege or the Balcombe Street siege, of which you may or may not have heard. The effect of all this you may find very interesting. I told you we got about 120,000 or so police officers in Britain. The average number of police officers murdered on duty in any year in the last 10 or 20 years is between 1 and 2 a year. And the total number of civilians, if my research is correct, killed by the entire police service, all the 43 forces, in the 32 years since the war, is 4. And incidentally, in every one of those cases, a coroner's jury, considering each at great length, came to the conclusion that the police virtually had no choice. Now, even more interesting is the police reaction to terrorism. If you perhaps concede that the picture I have painted so far is one of comparatively civilized, moderate police reaction to such violence as they have to face, consider now their reaction to real violence, and sometimes frightening violence. By the end of 1976, there had been 263 terrorist incidents in 3.5 years, and these involved 302 devices, by which I mean car bombs, parcel bombs, letter bombs, automatic weapons, or shootings, that kind of thing. 57 people had been killed, some of them in cold blood, and many, many more had been injured. But 148 persons had been arrested and charged with terrorism. That's roughly 1 for every 2 crimes. In London, 68% of all terrorist incidents, including all but one of the major ones, have been cleared up by arrest. And all this, ladies and gentlemen, without the police killing, wounding, or injuring a single terrorist. Does it surprise you that much of the praise and admiration and support of the police comes from the 1.5 million thoroughly decent, hard-working Irish people who live in Britain? And indeed, quite a lot comes from Irish people living on both sides of the border of that unhappily divided country. Now, I think I ought to touch briefly on our relationship with the press only because there are differences in our two countries. The freedom of the press in criminal matters, on which you rely so much, is very much more restricted in Britain than in America. We have no written constitution, and therefore, of course, it doesn't require a great brain to see that we have also no First Amendment. Even before arrest, the press may not publish anything at all likely to prejudice a fair trial, such as the previous convictions of a suspected person. And once a charge has actually been preferred, the press may not print anything other than the briefest details without risking contempt of court, which can involve very serious penalties. Even during what we call committal proceedings in the lower court, before trial by jury, the restrictions on publicity can only be lifted by request of the defense, not of the prosecution. For decades, we in the police took a very improper advantage of this situation by withholding from the press information going far beyond that which would be likely to prejudice a fair trial. And there evolved from this a very nasty, unhealthy relationship which encouraged the disclosure of information by particular detectives to journalists in return for material rewards or even just for image building in the newspapers. And that's how some of the myths of Scotland Yard came into being. All that, happily, was changed by the unilateral action of the police in 1972, when we said to the 37 editors of London, look, the sub judice rules apply to you as much as to us. Let's stop all this. In future, you will be given as of right all information which consists of matters of fact within the knowledge of the police, which is not likely to impair the security of the state or impair the privacy of the individuals. And we want no favours in return. We do this because we think that the more accountable we seem to be to the public, the greater their confidence will be in us. In other words, an open book is less likely to have stains on its pages. And I must say that we learnt by doing that something we should have learnt years ago, that the best answer to criticism in a newspaper is not a pompous, self-justifying statement from Scotland Yard, but simply to allow other journalists to come and look at the evidence on which the criticism is based. We find that has worked very effectively. Now, this may seem very unusual to you with your tradition of a free press, but to us, having lived with the press in a state of open hostility amounting almost to warfare for the best part of a century, and in my time, having seen an editor summarily confined to prison for 3 months and his newspaper fined £10,000 for contempt, you can imagine that it's one of the most important changes since the war. It's had a profound effect on our thinking. If a society is to be judged by the preservation of justice and logic under the stress of brutality and emotion, I think that Britain in recent years needn't fear the light of exposure.